Welcome back to episode 29 of More Than Words, where the Irish Sea turns out to be less a sea and more a conceptual placeholder, and going through somewhere has expanded to cover locations that aren't technically real. This week, a fictional island governed by a man in a top hat and narrated by an actual Beatle, a town that tried to build a rival to Liverpool and went bankrupt before the paint dried, and a waterfall called the Big Girl that drops 40 metres in 2 stages because even gravity thought better of doing it all in one go. Expect iron ore under the seabed, submarines assembled by 10,000 people who'd rather not discuss what's inside them, and a Victorian suspension bridge that ended the deeply unpleasant practice of swimming cattle across the Menai Strait. A win for farmers, an even bigger win for cattle. Think thunderous Cod War diplomacy meets Ringo Starr's narrative choices meets an island that lost its puffins to a shipwreck full of rats. Narrated by someone who has just quietly, accidentally fulfilled the complete Proclaimer's promise and is trying to decide whether that deserves a celebration or a lie down. This is episode 29. In Deep Water. Okay, as usual, time for our stage stats. So the total distance covered so far is 1,609.5 kilometres. That's 55.81% of the entire 2,884 kilometre journey. But more importantly, and I will not be moving on from this quickly, it's 1,000 miles. 500 miles and then 500 more. Done, logged, briefly celebrated, and then immediately downgraded by the spreadsheet to nice, but have you considered doing more? The time taken in real life to complete the mileage for this stage was from the 13th to the 17th of January 2026. 5 days, which is brisk, efficient, and achieved via the holy trinity of walking, golf and spin bike. My current position is 2.5 days ahead of schedule. The buffer is back, and it is meaningful. We're not getting comfortable, absolutely not. We're just acknowledging that 1,000 miles is 1,000 miles. The second half is well underway, and onward we go. Assuming the legs hold, the glutes cooperate, and nobody else decides to invent new weather. IRL. I did walk 500 miles, and I did walk 500 more. So, as we've just mentioned, stage 29 marked a milestone that deserves more fanfare than it's going to get. 1,000 miles completed. Or, if we're being metrically accurate, 1,609.34 kilometres. Which sounds less impressive in the same way that saying I was doing 80 km per hour lacks the authoritative ring of 50 miles per hour, despite describing the exact same thing. Miles have swagger, kilometres sound like they've been told to speak up but don't want to cause a fuss. 1,000 miles. A number with weight, history and the kind of round number satisfaction that makes spreadsheets briefly tolerable. It's also, and I cannot stress this enough, the exact distance the Proclaimers threatened to walk in 1988. 500 miles, then 500 more. Which means I have now unintentionally fulfilled the full Proclaimer promise. A feat that sits somewhere between impressive endurance and a worrying sign that I've started taking Scottish pop lyrics as life guidance. For additional context, 1,000 miles is London to Rome, 996 miles by road. Close enough that I could claim I've walked to the Vatican and only be lying by a rounding error. It's longer than Land's End to John O'Groats, which is 874 miles. So I've already exceeded Britain's classic end-to-end challenge and we're only halfway done. At this point, I should get a certificate or at least a polite nod from the Ordnance Survey. It's over halfway to Pony Express territory. The original route from Missouri to California was 1,900 miles. So I'm basically halfway to becoming a 19th century mail carrier, albeit one travelling considerably slower and with less risk of being injured by outlaws, unless you count pavement cyclists with no spatial awareness. It's the length of the Yukon 1000, a modern ultra-endurance race where paddlers travel 1,000 miles down the Yukon River through Alaska and Canada. Wild, dangerous, spectacular, and something I've matched without once fighting a bear, outrunning a moose, or sleeping in a canoe. My biggest wildlife encounter was a pigeon giving me side-eye. It's longer than the march to the wall in A Song of Ice and Fire. Winterfell to Castle Black is about 700 miles, but add the detours, ambushes and Stark family catastrophes and you're easily in 1,000 mile emotional damage territory. I've essentially walked the distance of a Westerosi coming-of-age trauma arc, just with fewer wolves and marginally better footwear. Basically, I've walked the sort of distance that historically required horses, religious devotion, or an army with a grudge. And I've done it while also holding down a retirement that mostly involves wondering what day it is and whether I've already had lunch. The week itself was standard fare. Street tramping, the dignified term for walking around the neighbourhood while pretending you have somewhere to be. Golf. Spoiling a good walk, as Mark Twain allegedly said, though he probably didn't, because most famous quotes collapse under fact-checking. And spin sessions, repeating the same motion over and over like you're auditioning for a reboot of Groundhog Day set in a leisure centre. One highlight was a team golf game, a Texas Scramble, a format designed to make average players feel useful and good players feel quietly resentful. Everyone hits a shot, the team picks the least disastrous one, and then you all shuffle over to that spot like a small confused pilgrimage. This repeats until the ball is holed, theoretically allowing weaker players to contribute without detonating the scorecard, and stronger players to carry the entire enterprise while pretending the rest of us aren't essentially decorative. The format sounds democratic until you realise what it actually means for your step count. A normal round of golf might involve walking 6 or 7 miles. A Texas Scramble can easily add another mile or two purely through the constant trekking between your ball and the team's chosen shot. You hit, you walk to collect your ball, you walk to where the best shot landed, you repeat this 70 times, and by the end you've logged serious mileage, even if your actual contribution to the team score was moral support. The paradox of the Texas Scramble. Your step count is loftier than normal, even if your scores aren't. You're simultaneously getting excellent exercise and being constantly reminded that someone else on your team is better at golf than you are. It's character building, cardiovascular and mildly humiliating. Everything you want from a Saturday morning. Between the street walks, the golf and the spin sessions, Stage 29 rolled over the 1,000 mile mark with the quiet satisfaction of someone who's realised they've accidentally achieved something significant while mostly just trying to keep a spreadsheet updated and avoid muscle spasms. 1,000 miles, exactly what the Proclaimers promised. Further than a start marching north, longer than Land's End to John O'Groats, and all of it achieved without wolves, canoes or being ambushed by bandits. Just an Apple Watch, an increasingly sceptical right leg, and the stubborn refusal to admit that this might have been a terrible idea. We're over halfway now, which means I don't have to endure a full second 1,000, just whatever fresh nonsense the next few hundred miles decide to inflict. Onward we go, assuming my legs continue to function, and the Proclaimers don't file a cease and desist for turning their chorus into a lifestyle. Stage 29 complete. Milestone achieved. Excel spreadsheet celebrating for roughly 3 seconds before snapping back to its default setting of passive-aggressive expectation. Virtual Insanity Stage 29. The Irish Sea Crossing, Part 1. Stage 29 is where the whole idea of going through a place finally abandons any pretense of geographical integrity and embraces full maritime fiction. We've left Douglas behind, pointed the ferry vaguely southeast towards Liverpool, and are now spending an entire stage in the middle of the Irish Sea, roughly 50 kilometres from the English coast, which means we're technically near places in the same way the moon is near the Earth if you squint and ignore the vacuum of space between them. What follows isn't a route so much as a wish list of coastal landmarks we might theoretically glimpse if the weather cooperates, the binoculars are set to science fiction, and nobody asks awkward questions about the difference between visiting and pointing at something from a boat while squinting. We begin, and I cannot emphasise this enough, with a fictional island populated by talking trains, because apparently that's the level of geographical realism we're operating at now. After that, it's on to actual English and Welsh coastal towns, viewed from a distance that makes detail optional and facts fully negotiable. This is cartography at its most aspirational, geography as a vibe, navigation as a form of optimism, and the ongoing suspension of disbelief that has powered this project ever since we collectively agreed that walking virtually counts as walking literally. Let's roll. Off the rails. Our first landmark is the island of Sodor, which presents an immediate problem, namely that it doesn't exist. Sodor is a fictional island conjured by the Reverend Wilbur Awdry in 1945 as a setting for the Railway series, the books that introduced the world to Thomas the Tank Engine and his improbably cheerful locomotive friends, each one apparently fuelled by steam, good manners and unresolved stress. Awdry needed a consistent location for his railway stories, somewhere technically within Great Britain, but far enough from the rest of British rail to let him make things up without being hunted down by timetable enthusiasts. Inspiration struck during a 1950 visit to the Isle of Man, which forms the Diocese of Sodor and Man. Audrey, a Church of England cleric, noticed that while there was an Isle of Man, there was no corresponding island of Sodor. The name itself is an anglicisation of Suðurea, Southern Isles, a Norse name for the Hebrides, meaning there was a Sodor, it just wasn't an island and hadn't been called that since the Vikings were still solving problems with enthusiasm and axes. Undeterred by minor inconveniences like historical accuracy and physical existence, Audrey simply created his own island of Sodor and plonked it in the Irish Sea between the Isle of Man and Barrow in Furness. He and his brother George then proceeded to design its history, geography, industry and even its language, Sudric, a Gaelic-Norse hybrid, producing more detail than most real towns manage. The notes were published in 1987 as The Island of Sodor, Its People, History and Railways, a book that reads like a perfectly serious gazetteer for a place that is, in every measurable sense, imaginary. According to Audrey's specifications, Sodor is roughly diamond-shaped, 62 miles wide and 51 miles long, considerably larger than the Isle of Man, which presumably doesn't mind being fictionally overshadowed by an island that doesn't exist. The capital is Sudbury, though the largest town is Tidmouth, where the Fat Controller, officially Sir Topham Hatt, runs a North-Western railway with the serene confidence of a man protected by children's literature and a complete absence of unions. The island's railway network includes standard gauge, narrow gauge, a rack and pinion mountain railway and a 15-inch gauge line. The trains are sentient, possess distinct personalities, occasionally misbehave, and are kept in line by the Fat Controller using management techniques that would now require a safeguarding policy, a training video and possibly a tribunal. Then came the TV series Thomas and Friends in 1984, which launched Sodor into global consciousness, helped enormously by the fact that Ringo Starr, actual Beatle, served as the first narrator. Nothing says prestige children's television like a man who once played drums at Shea Stadium, calmly informing viewers that a small blue engine is feeling a bit put out today. It's one of the great cultural collisions of the 20th century. The drummer from the world's most famous band, lending his voice to a universe where trains learn moral lessons about sharing. Over 70 years, the franchise has generated billions in revenue through books, TV shows, films, merchandise, and the kind of brand recognition that means even people who've never seen an episode know what Thomas looks like. It's capitalism, powered by a small blue tank engine with an unsettlingly large face. And so here we are, in the Irish Sea, acknowledging a fictional island as the first waypoint on our route. Is it geographically accurate? No. Does it exist? Absolutely not. Does it belong on a travelogue documenting a virtual journey around the UK? Probably not, but we've come too far, and admitting the mistake now would require a level of honesty neither of us is prepared for. Sodor, the island that isn't, populated by talking trains, narrated by a Beatle, governed by a man in a top hat, and somehow more famous than several real places. Next stop, actual England, assuming we can locate it from this increasingly unhinged vantage point. Or, then no more. Squinting eastward through the maritime haze, we start to trace the English coast south on our journey towards Liverpool. First up is Millom, a Cumbrian town on the Duddon estuary about 10 miles south of the Lake District boundary. Its name comes from the Old Norse mytholum, meaning at the sandbanks, which is Viking shorthand for good luck with your foundations. Until the mid-19th century, Millom was a loose scattering of farms and villages minding their own business. Then, in 1855, someone discovered hematite iron ore at Barrow, one of the richest deposits ever found in Britain, and the town went from agricultural footnote to industrial supernova in under a decade. By 1880, the Barrow Mining Company had sunk shafts, built 6 blast furnaces, and was extracting 343,000 tonnes of ore a year from deposits so vast they stretched under the seabed, which is nature's way of saying, please stop digging, this bit belongs to the fish. This created a uniquely Victorian problem. How do you extract iron ore when half of it is technically in the Irish Sea? The answer, obviously, was to build enormous seawalls, designed to keep the ocean politely outside while miners burrowed away beneath it. The inner barrier, 1888 to 1890, and the outer barrier, 1900 to 1905, were feats of engineering that would make modern health and safety officers weep into their clipboards. Audacious, expensive, and based on the optimistic Victorian belief that walls can permanently defeat oceans, a theory the oceans have repeatedly rejected with enthusiasm. The mines finally closed in March 1968 after 105 years of operation, having extracted around 25 million tonnes of ore. Millom's population promptly collapsed, and the town entered a long, bleak period of economic decline. Today, Millom has about 5,800 residents, a railway station on the Cumbrian coastline, and the Barrow Nature Reserve, the flooded former mine now managed by the RSPB as a coastal lagoon and bird habitat, proving that even industrial catastrophes can eventually become Instagrammable. That sinking feeling. Further south along the Cumbrian coast sits Barrow in Furness, a town that exists primarily to build things that sink on purpose. Barrow is Britain's submarine capital, home to BAE Systems shipyard, where every Royal Navy submarine since the 1960s has been constructed, including the Astute-class attack submarines and the Dreadnought-class ballistic missile submarines that will carry Britain's nuclear deterrent well into the mid-21st century, assuming the world lasts that long and nobody gets curious about the large red button clearly labelled "Do Not Press." Like Millom, Barrow's industrial story began when iron ore was discovered in the area. The Furness Railway Company built docks in 1867, and Henry Schneider, an industrialist with impeccable timing, founded the Barrow Steelworks, turning the settlement into a Victorian boomtown almost overnight. By 1871, the population had surged from 325 in 1843 to over 18,000, making it one of the fastest growing towns in Britain. Shipbuilding quickly became Barrow's defining industry. The Barrow Shipbuilding Company, later Vickers Shipbuilding, produced warships, liners, and from 1886 onwards, submarines. The first was Nautilus, Britain's earliest practical submarine, designed by Reverend George Garrett and built in collaboration with Swedish inventor Torsten Nordenfeldt. It didn't work terribly well, few early submarines did, but it generated just enough momentum for Barrow to keep building them until one finally behaved. From there the town doubled down. HMS Vanguard, Britain's first ballistic missile submarine, was launched here in 1992, followed by the Astute-class boats from 2007 onward. Today the shipyard employs over 10,000 people, roughly 1 in 7 Barrovians, making it one of the few places in the UK where heavy manufacturing still dominates the local economy. It's also one of the most secure sites in Britain. Fences, armed police, security checks, and the constant awareness that what's being assembled inside could, in theory, end civilization if someone has a particularly bad Monday. Modern Barrow is Cumbria's second largest urban area after Carlisle, a working town first and a coastal one only by geographical coincidence. The motto, by worth, not by birth, began life as a Victorian declaration of meritocracy, but these days it feels more like a quiet acknowledgement of what the place actually does. Barrow wakes up, glances at the Irish Sea and essentially says, "Lovely view, but there's a submarine to finish before lunch." Cod giveth, Iceland taketh away. Fleetwood appears on the southern horizon, a Lancashire town perched at the northwest corner of the Fylde Peninsula, right where the River Wyre gives up and hands itself over to the Irish Sea. The place was essentially invented in the 1830s by Peter Hesketh Fleetwood, a landowner and MP who decided to create a fashionable resort and major port simultaneously. The sort of Victorian mega-project that either makes you a visionary or bankrupts you so comprehensively your descendants only inherit nothing but a stack of letters beginning with "Final Notice." In his case, it was very much the latter. He hired architect Decimus Burton to design the town's civic centrepiece, a geometric street grid, a hotel and 2 lighthouses, the Upper and Lower Pharos, modelled on the ancient lighthouse of Alexandria, because if you're going to build a new town from scratch, you might as well give it the architectural equivalent of a superiority complex. Fleetwood was meant to be the western terminus of the Preston and Wyre Railway, a rival to Liverpool, and a new glittering gateway to the Irish Sea. The railway arrived in 1840, the grandeur did not. Hesketh Fleetwood went bankrupt in 1844 and died penniless in 1866, which is about as Victorian an ending as you can script without adding cholera. What actually saved Fleetwood was fishing. It began as a side gig for pilots killing time between guiding ships, but everything changed in 1891 with the launch of Lark, the port's first steam trawler. Fleetwood had a unique advantage. All the major fishing ports, Hull, Grimsby, Aberdeen, were on the east coast, so Fleetwood became the west coast gateway to the North Atlantic. By the 1920s, the port employed more than 9,000 people and operated nearly 200 trawlers, specialising in hake after entrepreneur James Marr realised you could sell it to Lancashire mill towns if you marketed it with enough confidence. Then, the Cod Wars arrived. The Cod Wars, 1958 to 61, 72 to 73, and 75 to 76, were not a Marvel DC crossover where Thor fights Aquaman over fishing quotas, but were in fact one of those surreal 20th century episodes where two nations, Britain and Iceland, managed to have a geopolitical meltdown over fish, and somehow it was Iceland that kept winning. Picture it, a tiny nation with no standing army squaring up to the Royal Navy and saying essentially, move your trawlers or we'll ram you again. And they did, repeatedly, while Britain responded with the diplomatic equivalent of a long frustrated sigh. Iceland kept extending its territorial waters, 12 miles, then 50, then 200, like a teenager pushing curfew just to see what happens. And every time Britain protested, Iceland simply pointed at the cod and said, "That's ours, mate." By the end, Britain had withdrawn, Iceland had secured its fishing grounds, and Fleetwood, heavily dependent on those waters, saw its deep-sea fleet collapse almost overnight. The last of the big trawlers left in the early 1980s, marking the end of a century-long era and leaving the docks with the hollow, echoing stillness of a place that's just realised it no longer has a purpose. By shell or high water. Cleveley's arrives next on the horizon, looking like Blackpool's quieter, better-behaved sibling, the one that stayed home, read books, and developed a tasteful promenade instead of a neon-induced personality disorder. Once a rural hamlet on the Foul Coast, it grew into a seaside resort in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, helped along by the arrival of the tramway and the Victorian compulsion to turn every stretch of coastline into a leisure destination, whether it wanted to be one or not. The modern seafront is a broad sweep of coastal defences and public space, rebuilt to withstand the Irish Sea's occasional habit of trying to relocate the town inland. It's also home to the Mythic Coast, a public art trail inspired by the sea swallow, a children's story that weaves together local folklore, and the legend of Singleton Thorpe, a drowned village said to lie beneath the waves. As a result, Cleveley's is one of the few places in Britain where you can take a morning walk and encounter a giant metal seashell, an ogre's paddle, and a 10-metre aluminium beacon without anyone thinking you've wandered into a fantasy convention by mistake. The best known piece is Mary's Shell, a huge twisting sculpture that sits on the beach like something Neptune left behind after a heavy night. At low tide you can walk inside it. At high tide it disappears beneath the waves, which is Cleveley's way of reminding visitors that the sea is still in charge, no matter how many artworks you bolt to the foreshore. Cleveley's also has its own quiet oddities, a coastline that occasionally reveals prehistoric tree stumps at very low tide, wartime government departments that once relocated here for safety, and a promenade that somehow manages to feel both contemporary and nostalgic, like a seaside town that finally went to therapy, set some boundaries, and now politely insists the sea stays on its side of the line. A tall story. Blackpool announces itself long before you arrive from most directions. A shimmering hallucination on the horizon, crowned by Blackpool Tower, a 518-foot steel lattice erected in 1894 as Britain's answer to the Eiffel Tower, except with more rust and wind. It also has a circus at the base, directly beneath the structure, a Victorian decision that feels like someone said, "What if we put the elephants under the 500-foot steel thing?" and everyone else just nodded. The tower has been Grade 1 listed since 1973, and its interior still also houses a ballroom, aquarium and viewing deck. essentially a Victorian multiplex, except with more clowns and fewer fire exits. The town began life as a small fishing settlement, and by the 18th century sea bathing had become medically fashionable, transforming Blackpool into a resort for those who believed salt water could cure everything from respiratory ailments to gout. The real explosion came in 1846 with the railway, which delivered millions of working-class holidaymakers from Lancashire's industrial towns. Proof that if you build a train line to the seaside will never know peace again. Blackpool's name, incidentally, is not metaphorical. It comes from a literal black pool, a peat-stained stream from Marton Moss that once flowed across the sands, darkened by tannins like a giant mug of builder's tea someone knocked over on the foreshore. This is the most Blackpool fact imaginable, even the water turned up pre-discoloured. Blackpool Pleasure Beach, opened in 1896, remains one of Britain's most visited tourist attractions, home to roller coasters with names like the Big One and Icon, each designed to make you question your life choices mid-loop. As kids, we went to Blackpool regularly, and this was the gravitational centre of the trip, the place I wanted to stay until someone physically removed me. A full day meant rattling around the Grand National, a classic twin-track racing coaster now approaching its 90th year, getting lost in the funhouse, and feeding 2p coins into the penny falls machines with the solemn focus of a tiny Victorian millworker on piecework. And then there are the illuminations. 5 miles of lights, lasers, neon displays and themed installations switched on annually from late August to early November. They began in 1879 with 8 arc lamps on 60-foot poles, which must have looked like witchcraft at the time, and now attracts 3.5 million visitors a year, many of whom come specifically to sit in traffic on the promenade and shout at each other. Blackpool today exists in a state of permanent negotiation with its own past. The illuminations still blaze, the tower still watches, and the sea still turns up twice a day to see how things are getting on. The promenade remains a rotating cast of trams, staggered hen parties, mobility scooters and seagulls with criminal intent. Blackpool remains one of the few places in Britain where spectacle is treated as civic duty. A resort that knows exactly what it is, remembers what it was, and carries on regardless, refusing to fade, because fading would be boring, and Blackpool has never once been that. Green Day. Lytham St Anne's, just south of Blackpool, represents the opposite approach to seaside tourism. Genteel, refined, and determined to prove that not all Lancashire coastal towns need to involve candy floss, roller coasters, or a man in a novelty hat shouting at a slot machine. Lytham and St Anne's were separate entities until 1922, when they merged to form the borough of Lytham St Anne's. The logic was simple and very British. It was cheaper, tidier, and far less absurd than running 2 sets of municipal offices a mile apart when they already shared transport and utilities and were basically cosplaying as 2 different towns for the fun of it. St Anne's Beach is described as an enormous natural beach with miles of open space and gardens, which is polite tourism speak for nothing happens here unless the wind is in a mood. It sits just far enough from Blackpool to feel like it's actively distancing itself from the noise and the lights. A short wander inland brings you to the Lytham windmill, standing on the green like it's posing for a postcard and absolutely knows it. From there, the Victorian promenade stretches out in a long, unwavering line. A perfect stage for people who walk slowly on purpose, often in pairs, often blocking the entire width of the pavement with the confidence of those who believe time is infinite. Then once a year, the whole place snaps out of its coastal meditation and becomes Glastonbury by Waitrose for the Lytham Festival, held right by the windmill. For a few days, the promenade fills with people who've paid good money to stand in a field by the sea and shout lyrics into the wind, before everything returns to its default setting of polite tranquility. It's more Prosecco in a reusable cup than warm cider from a plastic bottle. A festival that somehow manages to feel both jubilant and quietly determined to wrap up at a reasonable hour. Suspension of disbelief. So here we are, looking south from the ferry towards the North Wales mainland. The closest we'll get to Wales on this leg. We're not going there, obviously. That would require intention, planning and possibly a coat. but the Welsh coast is right there, waving at us like a neighbour who spotted you through the blinds, and now you have to pretend you were already heading out. And rising out of the haze, Anglesey, or in Welsh, Ynys Mon, which sounds like a Jedi Master, but translates to Island of Mon. It's 276 square miles of farmland, coastline, and about 70,000 people who spent centuries being invaded by anyone with a boat, a sword, or just a free afternoon. The Romans called it Mona, and in AD 60 they'd popped over to massacre the Druids, who were considered a threat to Roman authority, what with their robes, white beards, and habit of performing rituals that look suspiciously like HR violations. Then came the Vikings, the Normans, the English, basically everyone except the cast of Love Island, though give it time. And Edward I capped it off by building Beaumaris Castle in 1295 as part of his Iron Ring of fortifications, designed to remind the Welsh who was boss. Even the geology has drama. The island is stitched together from multiple terrains, fused over hundreds of millions of years like a tectonic patchwork quilt. Victorian women geologists were among the first to map and interpret it, giving talks to local groups long before geology was considered a respectable hobby for anyone without a beard. Anglesey's historical exports included grain, cattle and slate, and its strategic importance came from Holyhead, the port offering the shortest sea crossing to Ireland. After the Act of Union in 1800, traffic between London and Dublin surged, and suddenly everyone cared about crossing the Menai Strait without losing livestock, luggage or Antiglenis. Enter our old friend Thomas Telford, who in 1826 completed the world's first major modern suspension bridge, the Menai Suspension Bridge, a 580-foot span with 100 feet of clearance for tall ships, because the Admiralty insisted on being difficult. 16 chain cables, each made of 935 iron bars, hung from limestone towers quarried at Penmon. The bridge cut the London to Holyhead journey from 36 hours to 27, which in the 1820s was the difference between "I'm flagging a bit" and "my brain has left the chat." It also ended the practice of swimming cattle across the strait, a win for farmers and a bigger win for cows who had never asked for triathlon training. Then in 1850, Robert Stephenson built the Britannia Bridge, a tubular railway bridge guarded by 4 enormous stone lions, 25 feet long, 80 tons each, who have the facial expressions of creatures who've witnessed too many chapters of British history and would quite like a lie down. In 1970, 2 teenagers accidentally set the bridge on fire, and the whole thing had to be rebuilt as a 2-tier road and rail structure, proving once again that no Victorian achievement is safe from the unstoppable force of teenage stupidity. Today, Anglesey is connected to the main line by both bridges, produces more renewable energy than it uses thanks to wind farms, and remains proudly Welsh. Bilingual signs, bilingual schools, and over half of the population speaking Welsh, which is more than you'll get from any app that thinks learning a language means shouting at you until you feel guilty. For the birds. Our last view from the ferry for this stage is Penmon, sitting on Anglesey's eastern tip, a peninsula jutting towards the mainland with views across to Puffin Island. The name literally means end of Mon, which is Welsh for this as far as you're getting before you need a boat. It all started in the 6th century when St Ceriol, patron saint of "I just need some peace and quiet," founded a monastery here, part of the Celtic Christian habit of building holy sites in places so remote even God had to squint to find them. By the medieval period, the place had grown into Penmon Priory, until Henry VIII shut it down in the 1530s during his national rebranding phase. The surviving stonework looks like the masons were fuelled entirely by anxiety and whatever passed for caffeine in the 12th century, zigzags, spirals, chevrons. It's less holy craftsmanship and more men on an island slowly losing the plot with a chisel. Then there's Penmon Point Lighthouse, built in 1838, a modest stone tower whose main function is to warn ships, hard bits incoming, steer accordingly. It stands guard over the channel between Anglesey and Puffin Island, a stretch of water so notoriously tricky it might as well have been designed by a committee of disgruntled mermaids. Puffin Island itself is a seabird sanctuary, home to guillemots, razorbills, cormorants and shags. Basically, every bird that sounds like it was named by a Victorian with a sense of humour. What it doesn't have is puffins, because centuries ago a bunch of shipwrecked rats washed ashore, staged a quiet but efficient coup, and evicted the entire Puffin population. The name now feels less like a description and more like a missing persons report no one's updated. Penmon, the point where Anglesey finally runs out of land, patience and puffins. All at sea. And that's stage 29. An entire stage spent bobbing around in the Irish Sea, squinting at coastlines, saluting a fictional island full of talking trains, and perfecting the noble art of maritime guesswork. We've traced England from Millom's iron mines to Barrow's submarine pens, past Fleetwood's vanished fleet and Blackpool's neon delirium, before turning our binoculars towards Anglesey, Wales' largest island, bolted to the mainland by Telford's genius and Stevenson's tubes. Next stage, more Irish Sea shenanigans, then Liverpool, the Mersey, the Beatles, and the beginning of the end of this prolonged aquatic approximation of geography. Well, almost. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.